Omar Fajiri, welcome to Strategy Simplified. Where does this podcast recording find you? Where are you calling in from?
I am calling in from Seattle, Washington. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm sure it's a beautiful time in the Pacific Northwest this time of year. Really looking forward to this conversation today. Can you just kick us right off and give us a 30-second introduction of who you are and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Omar Fajiri. I recently graduated from the University of Washington here in Seattle, where I studied business administration and political science. I've grown up in the Seattle area my whole life and have learned to become very invested, both in the outdoors, but also a lot of community. So a lot of the work I've done over the past few years has been around community organizations and mobilizing kind of small businesses, small nonprofits. And ultimately, a lot of that work has brought me here to consulting, where I will be starting at McKinsey in January.
That's amazing. Well, congrats on the McKinsey offer. That's an incredible firm and an incredible opportunity, and we're so excited for you. And one other thing that I'll just add to your long resume there is that you are a content intern here at Management Consulted. So it's been great having you on the team, helping out producing this content that's going out to aspiring and current consultants all across the world. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, you've had a lot of community involvement, a lot of kind of extracurricular activities. But then you landed with strategy consulting. What was the pathway to realizing that, consulting might be something that you want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a lot of people, they can kind of come on and say that they always knew they wanted to do management/strategy consulting. For me, it was a little different. I came into undergrad studying bioengineering, mostly by the pressure of my parents, but at the same time, I had an interest in technology, but most importantly, like medical access to underserved communities. And that's kind of how I found my involvement in the STEM field. But throughout college, I had kind of jumped around major to major. I went from bioengineering to potentially studying informatics, to even communications. And I think the one thing that I found was a common denominator between like all of them was there was always some problem that I could see myself solving in that field, whether it be access or the ability for like my community to prosper in those industries. There was always something I wanted to solve. And so I finally had joined this consulting group on campus that was known as Business Impact Group. And essentially what we do is we specifically consult small businesses that are minority or women owned. And one thing that really showed me was that even in the consulting field, a lot of these businesses don't necessarily have the resources they need to thrive in a competitive economy. And so having just the experience to have that be my first experience in consulting was really eye-opening. And I thought maybe I should start applying for firms and just gauging kind of the work they do, the industries they work in, and the impact of that on a lot of businesses across the country.
That's awesome. So you got involved with this hands-on consulting group. What was it about the work that you were doing that really stood out to you most and confirmed that hey, maybe this is a career path that's right for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing was just my ability to upfront see the impact. I think a lot of the times it's difficult to see whether or not the work you're doing is actually going to make it far enough or whether you're going to have tangible results to see. In my case, I was actually consulting for another consulting firm, which was really fun. But a lot of it was growth marketing, just exploring how they could get new clients. And we had developed an entire growth marketing campaign. And within like 2 months of presenting our recommendations, we could already see the company implementing them. And I think just having that ability to see that my work was seen, implemented, and that it was also creating results was really it for me. That was probably my light bulb moment.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm picking up the thread of like impact oriented, like that's kind of a little bit of what drives you, and I'm sure that's a huge part of why consulting for you. So you start applying to firms. What's the process after that? Like, just give us a high level overview of, hey, from the time you started applying to eventually landing with McKinsey. What did that look like, and what are some challenges you encountered in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I applied to McKinsey in, I would say, early July. I believe the application deadline was the 7th last year. And between then and my first interview invitation, I believe it was around 2 to 3 weeks, which honestly was a pretty short amount of time. I think looking back, it was a really short amount of time, just given how much I was lacking in kind of case interview preparation and just behavioral interview preparation. So I think one thing I would recommend just off the bat is like be very early and intentional about
Mm.
when you start your preparation, because the turnaround can be quick, especially I know for other firms as well. You can get interview invitations like the week after you apply, and you kind of just never know. But
Yeah.
the great thing was that once I did receive my interview invitation, I had the option to kind of just schedule out when I wanted it. So I was able to just map out my case interview prep a little more. So I had interviewed in early September before I had finally received the offer. And for my office specifically, it wasn't multiple interview rounds. It ended up being one super day. So as opposed to two separate days where you kind of have your first round interview and your final round interview, it was just a full day of interviews back to back. And you would know shortly whether you had received an offer.
Okay, well, walk us through the Super Day a little bit, because it used to be a little more common, but I think a lot of folks don't necessarily know about it, or they don't really have insight on what to expect from that. So just walk us through, like, uh, how many interviews did you do? Were you in a room with 17 other candidates? Like, did you, go out to lunch with the office, or what did that look like?
Yeah, so my super day was entirely virtual. Um, and it started off, I believe, from I would say like my first interview was at 8:30 and it probably had ended completely by 4. And it was 4 blocks. And you essentially were paired with one engagement manager, I believe, per interview. And you have a final round partner round. And throughout the day, they give you breaks. I think the most important thing was that each interview was both a behavioral and case. So throughout the
Okay.
day, you get 4 case interviews, 4 behaviorals, within, I believe it was an hour block each. So around 4 to 5 hours of interviewing in total. And by
Yeah.
the next week, I believe I had gotten the call.
So just one super intense day of interviews, and then you're done. So both a blessing and a curse, I'm sure.
No, for
Uh,
sure. It was a very, very long day, but
I
it
can
was
imagine.
good. Yeah, I would say it was really cool to just be able to meet with 4 different individuals who've worked at the company for like multiple years and just like hear all of their different stories and experiences.
So you got on the train a little bit late for case prep, which is not uncommon at all. But once you heard that you got an interview and you knew you had that coming, how did you prep? So, can you just share your overall approach? Both to behavioral and case interviews, and I might double click into some of those portions.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I started my case prep first on YouTube. I think people really, really underestimate how many resources are free and available to you on YouTube, including management consulted videos. Like lots of videos will just go through sample case frameworks, will give you like free resources to one-on-one case interviews with real candidates who've successfully landed an offer. And I think just being able to learn from candidates who've successfully gone through the process is really invaluable, mainly because they have the most exposure, but also because they're really good at casing. um, so I
Yep.
think that was a really important resource for me, especially for the foundationals. I think a big part of case interview prep is just knowing the frameworks, but also learning how to adapt them to a certain case you're given, especially if it's a non-traditional case that a lot of firms are doing much more often than
Mm.
they were years prior. Things like nonprofit cases or government cases, I think just learning to adapt those traditional market entry frameworks will become very valuable to you. And I think after learning a lot of those foundational materials, I started finding partners. And for me, I was always really nervous about casing with people I was like really familiar with. So I found like case sites online where you could partner with people who were interviewing in different countries. So I would be working with people in different time zones. But I think that was also really good because you were able to interview with people at different kind of stages of their recruitment level. You can have kind of partners who are really advanced in their case prep and who can give you a lot of feedback, or people who are just starting out and you can kind of practice your interviewing skills, both of which are equally as important in your case prep.
Mm. Diving deep into the case a little bit, when you first started, what were some like common hangups or roadblocks that you encountered within the case interview or within your case prep? And can you kind of walk us through how you overcame those? Because I think a lot of folks sometimes they get into the process and they hit roadblocks, but they don't know what those are or how to overcome those. And so I just love to dig into your process behind that a little bit.
Yeah. For me, the biggest roadblock during my case preparation was definitely the quantitative section. I think I always had struggled at the time to like structure my answers. And it was also just a big indicator of whether or not you could do math quickly and in a structured manner. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I think a lot of people tend to struggle with the quantitative portion the most. And I think the biggest solution is just to drill. I think one thing I did that really made my prep a lot more efficient was that when reading through cases, I would only drill like the quantitative portion, for example, and just go through case after case and only drill that section because I knew that that was the section that was going to really give me a hard time in the real thing. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think just really focusing on what your weakness is in that given moment, and just trying to drill those when you're doing multiple cases is really, really valuable.
Sounds like you've been reading Management Consultant's blog or watching some YouTube videos. That's very much aligned with how we coach candidates when we're one on one, right? Like we identify the gap areas and then we just drill down on those until we see improvement and so until folks are case ready. So I appreciate you sharing your insights on that. Uh, Transitioning over to the behavioral side of the interview section, it's an area that a lot of people really underestimate and don't really put much time into prepping for. Did you find that you needed a lot of prep time, or kind of was it natural for you? And can you just walk us through your experience with the behavioral side of the interviews?
Yeah, I think behaviorals were definitely less stressful on my part. I think I had a much easier time kind of communicating my interest in consulting and my interest in the firm. And at the same time, it was also difficult because a lot of the times interviewers in like a behavioral interview prep or behavioral interview situation will like ask you questions you're unprepared for, right? Like that's inevitable. And I think being able to prepare for behaviorals is quite difficult just because you don't really know what they're going to ask. But I would say my experience with behaviorals was overall pretty well. I had like obviously the preparation by going through a list of brainstorming questions on different sites, but also just
Mm.
really going through the values of the firm. I think was really valuable to my preparation because at the end of the day, I saw behavioral interviews as just an indicator of whether a candidate was fit for the firm, but also whether they were fit for the consulting industry. And so having a good grasp of a firm's values and principles and kind of what they're looking for in their company culture will really help you, and also helped me really articulate why that firm was for me and why consulting was for me.
Yeah, I love that tip about aligning with the firm's values. It, with the overall kind of interview prep process, are there any common mistakes that you've seen candidates make, in the process that you would, or even mistakes that you made and looking back, like, oh, should have done this differently? Or any kind of words of wisdom you can share from your experience?
Yeah, I think going back to behaviorals, it is really easy to underestimate them. I think in my situation, like I did feel more comfortable performing in behavioral interviews, but at the same time, like I had not prepared my stories as much or prepared multiple different stories because I was so focused on the case interview. So when it had come time for behaviorals, it almost felt like I was kind of spewing the same information or telling the same story at
Hmm.
times. And that is never the best case situation. So I think be really intentional with your prep for behaviorals, even if it's less time that you're given than the case interview, it's still a really important part of the interview process. And so I would treat it just like a case interview, both in your prep, but also in the way you deliver. Like make sure your answers are structured, come prepared with like
Hmm.
multiple experiences that you have really carved out and that you can speak to very well.
What I'm hearing you say is don't shoot yourself in the foot by only focusing on the case side of preparation. Uh, you don't want to just you know wing it, show up, hoping that hoping that your natural talent is good enough without any preparation. Omar, what's the best piece of advice that you received? It doesn't have to be about the recruiting process, but maybe it's just general career advice, or it can be something specific to recruiting. But what's a piece of advice that has stayed with you through this time?
Good question. I would say for a lot of people interested in consulting or just strategy in general, it's really easy to fall into this trap or idea that you have to come from this extensive business slash finance background, or that if your experiences aren't necessarily aligned with like consulting groups on your campus, that you won't have a strong shot in this field. And I think coming from someone who was very invested, mainly honestly, in humanities and where a lot of my experiences aligned more so with the humanities than it did my business studies. I think really being intentional with the experiences that you have that are aligned with problem solving more so than the
Mm.
experiences that are aligned with kind of a business background will really help you in this field, um, or mainly just in recruitment in general. I think if you have experiences that aren't necessarily consulting projects or case competitions, you can still speak to how those experiences helped shape your problem solving skills or your analytical skills, even if they weren't directly working with a client engagement. And I think a lot of people will try to heavily invest in consulting groups or just do as many case competitions as they can to really prove that they have problem solving skills. But in reality, a lot of the work we do outside of these things have very valuable and legitimate analytical
Mm.
skills that we can speak to. Um, and that also provide a very niche perspective to you and your story. So I would say prioritize those.
That's gold. I really love that. And I want to lean into that a little bit more because we have hundreds of folks who come up to us, each month, each year, who they have a humanities background, they have a liberal arts background, they have a healthcare background, whatever, and they disqualify themselves from consulting because they don't have quote unquote business or consulting experience. But what you're saying is that you can reframe your experience in terms of being a problem solver, being a fill in the blank of what consultants do, uh, you know, and you can leverage that because you can't go back and change your experience, but you can reframe the story you're telling for yeah.
Absolutely. I think there's always a way to reframe the work you've done in any industry because there will always be hardships that you're experiencing. There will always be things that you had needed to solve, um, even if they're in a manner that isn't necessarily aligned with commerce or like industry. There's always a way to reframe them to make you a problem solver, and to kind of communicate that.
Yeah, I love that. Is there anything else you want to leave folks with, especially for folks who do come from a non-business, non-consulting background? Like, is there any like a resume tip or a networking tip or just one practical thing you can leave folks with who are in that bucket of, hey, I don't feel like I have a shot at consulting because of my background?
Yeah, I can leave especially younger candidates with this. I think a lot of the times coming in to your first undergraduate experience, it's really easy to fall into this trap that you need to join all of these competitive clubs or join kind of these organizations that will buff up your resume to seem competitive to a lot of firms. And honestly, in my experience, that's not what they're looking for. I think more so what they're looking for is the passion that is prescribed to these activities that you're doing. So I would say do what makes you passionate. Ultimately, I know that kind of sounds cliche, but at the end of the day, like that's going to bring you the most joy. You're going to want to excel in it. And that is ultimately what's going to shine in front of the eyes of interviewers and recruiters more so than the name consulting group on campus that you've joined simply to buff up your resume.
I love that. That's some good truth right there. I think that's a great place to kind of start to wrap up here. And yeah, so you're getting towards starting at McKinsey in just a couple short months. But what is one or what are two things you're looking forward to about starting officially in strategy consulting?
Yeah, good question. I think the first, I'm really excited just more broadly about the different practice areas that I could potentially get invested in. I know I talked earlier about kind of all of the different career pathways that I explored. And so kind of just having a chance to be able to like work in technology, but also be able to work in the nonprofit sector. I'm really excited about. And the second, I think, is also travel. I think one thing I'm really looking forward to is just to be able to kind of work with different teams across the world. I think it's very rare to have that opportunity. And to be able to do that on really interesting and world impacting projects, I think is just something I could have never really seen myself doing had you asked me like 4 years ago. So just really excited to be able to network with people in different countries and if people working in all of these different industries.
That's awesome. You're gonna get to see a lot of the world, and it's gonna be life-changing experience. We're really excited for you and excited to continue working alongside you on the management consulted team. So we're gonna get into the portion of the show where we're gonna ask you a few get to know you questions and add some spice to the conversation, highlight you on a more personal level. So are you ready? Let's do it. All right. Well, speaking of travel, what's one place that's on your travel bucket list?
Yeah, I would say one place that I really, really want to go is definitely either between Singapore, Indonesia, or the Philippines. I think this summer had a really great chance to explore Europe, but I also have not seen a lot of the other parts of Asia and even South America. And so I really just want to just explore those different continents as well. But mainly Singapore. I have a lot of friends who visited and they have a really, really great time.
That's awesome. I love it. All right. What's your go-to Chick-fil-A order?
My go-to Chick-fil-A order would be, ooh, I think it's called the frozen lemonade, I think. But the frozen lemonade with a spicy chicken deluxe and the waffle fries, I think is my go-to.
Chick-fil-A's lemonade is super underrated, that's for sure.
No, it is so good. Like when they like when they freeze it, it's like a slushy almost. It's
Huh.
I recommend.
It's amazing. But yeah, man, can't go wrong with a spicy deluxe and the waffle fries. Good choice. All right, last question here. Do you have a favorite piece of media, whether it's a book, a podcast, a movie, etc., that you're, reading, listening to, or watching right now?
Yeah, recently I've been binging a lot of Black Mirror. I love that show. I think it's really entertaining, but also it just talks a lot about like real world context that is going on here and now. But kind of puts a twist on it. So it's really fun to watch. And you can relate to a lot of it too at the same time. So it's really good. I definitely recommend.
Okay, I'll have to add it to my list. Well, Omar, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining Strategy Simplified.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great time here at MC. So excited to keep going.
Awesome. Well, we will catch you around.